All right, welcome to yet another edition of Mystery Wire with George Knapp.
Hey, Ron.
George, how are you?
Good.
Good to see you today. I'm Ron Futrell. We've also got John Forrest and Carlos Sampson here working on the show and putting everything together and making the pieces happen. This is one of the most fascinating mysteries, certainly. We have a broad range of what a mystery is.
Multiple mysteries here, yeah.
But the Paul Fronczak story, when I first heard it, became really an international story, certainly, in so many ways. How did you first find out about Paul? Now, we're going to tell you you won't be disappointed when you hear his story. How'd you first find out about this?
It started with a phone call. And, a lot of people leave messages on my phone, and I have to be selective about which ones I can deal with. But as soon as I heard it, I called him back immediately. And he had this tale. Hey, as a baby, this baby was kidnapped back in 1962. It became a nationwide manhunt. I'm that baby, or at least I was supposedly going to be that baby. I just took a DNA test. I've grown up my whole life as Paul Fronczak, and in fact, I am not Paul Fronczak. I'm somebody else, and I'm going to start down this quest to figure out what happened to the real Paul Fronczak, and that led to an ongoing investigation, something we've been covering for 14 years now.
And it led to, you've got technology involved in this, you've got the mob eventually involved in this, all sorts of aspects, kidnapping, and a man's life who is remarkably well-adjusted for everything he's gone through, wouldn't you say?
Oh, my gosh. He's way more positive than I would be if I had survived all this and dealt with all the roadblocks and negative feelings and lies that he's dealt with for so long.
Okay, here's a story you did in 2022 with Paul Fronczak, going back through some of the history here, and it'll all piece together, and it's very fascinating. Here's that story.
Back in 2012, Henderson resident Paul Fronczak took a DNA test that cut the legs off of his life. He took a second test for us and confirmed the shocking truth. He wasn't Paul Fronczak after all. The bundle of energy at his side, daughter Emma, is a major reason he started his quest. And this is Emma and Paul today. Dad showing off his chops on the bass guitar and Emma adding the vocals. The 10 years in between were tumultuous. The pressure of a media whirlwind cost Paul his marriage, though the Fronczaks remained close. The loving couple who raised him as their own stopped speaking to Paul for a few years, hurt by the news that he was not their biological son and was searching for his birth parents. That too has changed.
Everything that we've done and all the different stories, and I've gotten so many tips, and we found Paul because of what we've done. And without that, my mom and dad would still be thinking that I was their son.
The real Paul Fronczak was born April 25, 1964, in a Chicago hospital. A day later, a woman dressed as a nurse stole the baby, grabbed the taxi, and vanished. It set off a massive nationwide manhunt, but police and the FBI never found the kidnapper or the baby. Nearly 2 years later, an infant found abandoned on a sidewalk in New Jersey reminded lawmen of the kidnapping. The boy, given the name Scott McKinley, was handed over to the Fronczaks, who legally adopted him. In a new book, True Identity, the man raised as Paul offers proof that the cops, FBI, and even the Fronczaks were probably aware he wasn't the real Paul. At age 10, adopted Paul found a box of news clippings about the kidnapping of his namesake, and that planted the seeds of doubt that years later led to that fateful DNA test.
It's a hard thing to decide that you're going to change your whole life to find the truth on something that nobody wants you to find.
Tips and leads poured into the website we created years ago. When a team of DNA detectives saw news coverage about the mystery, they joined the investigation. Hundreds of possible Pauls were ruled out, but obscure clues eventually led them to rural Michigan and a man named Kevin Beatty. In late 2020, the I-Team revealed that Beatty was, beyond any doubt, the real Paul Fronczak. Nevada Paul had written to his namesake, explained that he'd been living Paul's life, but the quiet Michigan man wanted nothing to do with it and declined to speak. He'd just received other shocking news, a diagnosis of terminal cancer. The pandemic also made a reunion difficult. Kevin Beatty died in 2020 on the same date that he'd been born at that Chicago hospital years earlier. But before he passed, he connected by phone with Dora Fronczak, his birth mother. Paul and Emma eavesdropped on one of those calls and were elated for the long-suffering Dora. It was a magical moment in more ways than one.
And I just wanted my mom and him to talk and just, just recognize that they're both alive and they're both still here, And at the end, after my mom actually talked with them, she said, Paul, this is great, but you're my son. I just wanted to cry, George. That was like the most meaningful. That made this whole journey, everything, all the peaks and valleys and all the crying, it made it all worthwhile.
Okay, and there was another fascinating part to this story. We'll let Paul break that part. You did an interview with Paul just recently,
Yes,
here, and he talks about another aspect of the story it's almost unbelievable, but it is indeed true. Here's Paul Fronczak.
So you have a twin sister. You recall the family members had told you that you had been held in cages with your twin sister Jill.
Yeah.
Jack and Jill. That's pretty clever.
Should be a happy ending.
Okay. Had a sister Jill, twin sister, at the time. What was the dysfunctional part of this family that he was born into initially? Raised by a great family, a marvelous family by all admissions, but born into a truly dysfunctional family.
Yeah, in a sense, this Paul hit the jackpot by surviving his birth family and ending up with the Fronczaks, because things could have ended very badly. So there's two mysteries he pursues. What happened to the baby that was kidnapped? And then, where did I come from? Where's my birth family? And as he went down that road, things got very dark. He learned that there were mob connections, that his dad was likely a mob-connected, crooked cop, that he had a sister. His name at birth was Jack Rosenthal. He had a sister named Jill, that other family members say they saw those two infants being kept in a cage, and then Jill disappears. So he has a new mystery to pursue. He went back, I think, with the ground-penetrating radar to the property where they used to live, because he suspected that Jill had died. They can't find any trace of her, but he suspected that she'd been killed and buried somewhere on that property. Couldn't find it. And he does have siblings, birth siblings, and tried to reconnect with them and had doors slammed in his face everywhere he went. There's also his dealings with the FBI, which you'd think would be happy to cooperate on a 62-year-old mystery. The kidnapping, by the way, at the time we're recording this, Ron, was earlier this week. It happened 62 years ago this week. And, so Paul is, the more he digs, the more mysterious things get, and the more questions he has to answer that are still lurking out there.
Okay, we're going to try to answer some of those questions, or at least raise more of them. I'm not sure, but we're going to jump into more of those issues involving the incredible story, the mystery of Paul Fronczak, when Mystery Wire continues. All right, welcome back, everybody. George, when you got that initial phone call from Paul Fronczak and then started following up on the story, you never had to think that the mob was going to be involved in this story somewhere, but you found out at some point. When did you first find that out, that there were mob connections with this?
This was a bonus. So as soon as Paul started focusing on tracking down his birth family and family roots, he reconnected with some distant relatives who filled him in on the background, and they were immediately telling him his dad had been a pretty bad guy. Finds out that he was a cop, probably a corrupt cop in Atlantic City, who, a den of iniquity and mob activity for decades. Now he's dug further back, found that his grandfather, who vanished, by the way, lived next door to a notorious mobster named Nicky Scarfo, was deeply in debt to the mob, and not surprisingly, vanished altogether. So the grandfather was involved with the mob, the dad was involved with the mob, and then there are all these other mysteries and dead ends in that part of it. As we'll get to later, there also turns out to be a mob connection on the other side of the mystery, tracking down who kidnapped baby Paul.
Okay, so here's, again, more of your interview with Paul Fronczak, recent interview, talking about those connections.
My grandfather, Harry, he was in Philadelphia. He owned a barber shop. He had illegal card games in the back. He owed the mob $15,000. He went missing. We found newspaper clippings of my dad and his brother and my grandma thrown out of their house, evicted because they couldn't pay the rent because Harry was missing. So that's how it started. My dad was a cop on the boardwalk. His brother was a grifter con man with no paper trail for like 50 years. their neighbor was Nicky Scarfo. So, what do you think, George?
You got mobsters everywhere.
Everywhere.
So it's easy for me to come to the conclusion on the outside looking in at this story that, okay, he was kidnapped to repay a mob debt. Does it sound like that to you?
I think it's two separate mob stories, but, let Paul figure that out at some point. But I think it's two separate mob outfits that were involved in this in different ways. The stuff about his dad and his grandfather and the fact that his sister is missing and his siblings who are alive won't even talk to him is really depressing. And as you mentioned before, it's amazing that Paul turned out to have such a positive attitude, but he really got into the spirit of this investigation. And as we'll get into a little bit later, he also has been helping other people who are in similar situations who are looking for their birth families, don't want to destroy anyone's life or anything or upset folks, but are curious about where they really came from.
And the connections now between him and the mob issues and technology certainly was a major part of this story. As you mentioned in that earlier story we had last segment, they contacted you, the DNA folks, we'll just call them that, from a private company to try to solve this. It took them a while. They were working nonstop on this to try to find out who he was.
Yeah. I mean, when we started this, they weren't that far along in being DNA detectives, but now it's become a lot better over the past few years since we've been pursuing this story. We had gone to Ancestry.com to try to track down leads there. And then as the story picked up steam and was repeated by national media, he had all kinds of DNA-type detectives offering to help him. C.C. Moore was one that was really instrumental in kind of nailing down some of the answers here. But yeah, as DNA technology has progressed, it's been a lot easier for him to get some answers and to help other people who are in the same situation.
And there weren't many answers coming from the FBI at the time. They were happy to they wanted case done. Case closed.
That was the interesting thing. After we had done a couple of stories and it was becoming well known all across the country, other major media, national media, picked it up. CBS and other networks were interested in it, and it kind of forced the FBI to reopen the case. They had seemingly no interest in reopening the case. I think they realized, they look in the files, they realized they screwed up way back when. They find a baby on a sidewalk in New Jersey and offer it to the Fronczak, who are heartbroken. Of course they're going to say, yeah, that's our baby, we'll take him. And I think they knew that it was wrong, and they washed their hands of it, and that's it. So they reluctantly reopened the case. They were not very cooperative, not with media, of course, and not with Paul Fronczak in terms of sharing information and trying to get the word out. And then eventually when the FBI confirmed where the real Paul Fronczak was and what his name was, Kevin Beatty, they didn't really want to say anything about it. I think they were glad to close the file and move along and not be embarrassed by how they had handled it over the decades.
Well, and here's Paul and his thoughts that he shared with you on the FBI and their involvement with this case.
After they said that I was Paul, that the FBI just closed everything. They didn't care about finding the kidnapper. My mom said they just wanted it to be done. They didn't care about her or anyone involved. They just wanted to close the case.
Well, if the case is closed, you should be able to get the records now. They can't get away with saying it's an ongoing investigation.
You would think, right?
Have you tried?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're trying.
Yeah.
Nothing yet.
Yeah, keep trying. His parents also, the parents that raised him, at least, seemed to be the most kind, loving parents that you could possibly have. Like you said, he won the lottery and lucked out. Went from a mobster family, dysfunctional mobster family, to a kind, loving family that had a difficult time dealing with this initially, didn't they?
It's true. I was with him when he sent the note, sent a letter to his mom and dad to explain, hey, look, I still feel as you as my parents, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it to try to help you and find out what happened to your baby. And they were really hurt. And for, I think, almost 2 years, they wouldn't talk to him. They had got on the phone and kind of read him the riot act and then cut off communication altogether. He kept going, though. Thank goodness he did, because there was a happy ending, at least for his mom, in this story.
No, we've got that and much more coming up for you on Mystery Wire to talk about the Paul Fronczak issue and some of the stories, just how complicated, convoluted it is, but it's this man's life and it's his story, and it is absolutely fascinating. We'll give you the latest and update you on where this mystery goes when Mystery Wire continues. Okay, the amazing, we'll call it mystery of Paul Fronczak here, trying to unfold everything that happened. And here's the reaction he says he got from his mom, not his real mom, but the mother who raised him. How about that? And her thoughts when he broke the news to her.
And was it good on both sides, that connection?
My mom was happy that she was able to have closure on that, I mean, but after we finished, she said that I'm still her son.
Well, that's good.
That was pretty cool.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Okay, so what's the latest news, update on the more mob connections, certainly with this? You've had to have dug into that quite a bit to figure out how this all started, what initiated
Well,
it.
I have to give Paul the credit for digging into it and the latest findings that we'll share in the longer interview and a news piece to come. But the fact that the FBI closed the case on this without investigating who kidnapped this baby and why, dropping that all together, aren't you a little bit curious who in Chicago would dress up as a nurse, walk into a hospital, and take off with a baby? Is it part of a black market of selling babies? What might it be? Well, Paul has done a lot of investigation on that end, and again, has ended up in mob territory. He thinks he knows the identity, finally, of the lady who posed as a nurse and took off with the baby. He thinks he knows how that baby and that woman were spirited out of Chicago, went to another state altogether, and there are some questions about how Kevin Beatty, the real Paul Fronczak, ended up in the upper Midwest. But, there's a lot of work still to be done on this. And everywhere you look, both the New Jersey side and on the Chicago side, there's mob involvement somewhere. So you'd think the FBI would really be interested in pursuing some of that. Maybe they'll reopen the case again. So far, they have not released the files. I know that, when Paul first called, he had taken this DNA test, which confirmed that he is not a Fronczak. He had suspected that growing up because he just didn't look like the rest of the Fronczaks. He looked quite different from his brother and his parents. And so it wasn't just a box of newspaper clippings that made him suspicious. Then he moves out here, and he figures, and his mom and dad are coming to town for a visit. He figured, well, what the heck? He talks him into doing a DNA test. We then confirmed the results by having him do another DNA test for us, and then subsequently all these other DNA detectives got in, and it was pretty certain he wasn't a Fronczak. Took him a while to find the Mr. Beatty, and Mr. Beatty wanted nothing to do with it, didn't want to talk to him because he was dying of cancer. He only had a certain amount of time to live. But thank goodness that Paul was able to reconnect Kevin, the real Paul Fronczak, with his birth mom, Mrs. Fronczak in Chicago, before Kevin passed away.
He has been absolute trooper through all of this, okay? And you know much better than I because you know him, but how he has fought through this and battled through this. No Vegas mob connections that you know of.
Who knows? His name is Rosenthal, for God's sake.
Well,
So-
there is a left-handed guy named Rosenthal that's Frank that spent a lot of time here in Las Vegas. But still, you're talking Jersey, Chicago mob, and those two places and connections. Where does this story go from here? Is there a conclusion that you anticipate?
Well, I think this is another happy ending. He's pretty sure he knows the identity of the person who did the kidnapping and the identity of the person who got her out of Chicago and where they went. But again, has hit a lot of dead ends. One good result of this is Paul has helped other people connect with their families. He's now got a podcast called The Fronczak Files. I interviewed he and his co-host recently, and they've had a number of success stories helping people who've gone through the same thing that Paul has gone, well, not quite the same thing that Paul's gone through, but a lot of it, reconnect with their families. And it's always tricky business.
So is the theory here that the real birth parents took Jill home from the hospital, but lost him?
No.
Did not take him. What am I missing on that part?
The real birth parents of the Fronczaks?
Yes.
They had a baby, and they had it for one day, and someone walked in and took it. Yeah.
So they just had those. That's
Yeah,
right.
and
Okay,
then-
wait a second. Now
Then a baby is found almost 2 years later on a sidewalk. It had been abandoned on a sidewalk in New Jersey, and it was sent to law enforcement. And these guys had been working the case, thought, could that be the Fronczak baby? And they used the comparison of the one photo of Paul Fronczak in the hospital. The ears look similar, so they said, what the heck? What do you think? Is this your kid? To the Fronczaks, and they said, yeah, let's have it. You know,
Okay,
and
so then the theory then back in New Jersey, where Paul was being raised as a young boy by his birth parents with Jill, that something happened to her, and they said we got to get rid of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
twin, and let's dump him on a street corner.
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. There's some sympathetic person in his family, I think he knows who it is, who saw what happened to Jill and saw what happened, how Jack and Jill were being raised, and who spirited him away, dropped him on a sidewalk, and hoped that authorities would pick him up. But that saved his life. I mean, I think even if he hadn't died as Jill died, presumably if she is dead, it would have been a miserable life based on what we know about that family.
I need a score sheet here to
Yeah.
no, seriously, to keep track. Okay, so where's he at today, real quick, and what's he up to today, Paul Fronczak?
He lives
still
here.
investigating.
Yeah, he lives here. He's still investigating his own case on both sides. There are a lot of threads that lead to nowhere, so he's still working really hard. He established this website called the Fronczak Files, and they get tips from all over the country every day, and they try to help people reunite families, assuming that everybody on both sides is interested in reuniting. That's tricky business. You know, you come out of nowhere and say, hey, I'm your long-lost brother from 35 years. You don't know me. I mean, a lot of people assume, what do you want? You know, you need money, you need help or something like that. So it's always a tense moment when you try to make those reunions, but that's the work they've been doing. The podcast is doing well. Paul has written the 2 books that we've shown the covers of that have also done really well. There was a national network TV special about him. I think CNN did that program. CBS's 48 Hours had come here in the early days of the story. Barbara Walters got Paul for an interview, scooped him up, and did a special as well. And I think there's a lot of other media interest as well. And certainly when these new details come out, which we're getting ready to unload some of them, I think there'll be a lot of knocks on his door.
Okay, you can go to our website, 8newsnow.com, Mystery Wire tab there to be able to get the latest interview, the full interview that George had with Paul Fronczak, and much more, many more details there. So thank you. A fascinating mystery is still unfolding.
Mysteries, plural.
Mysteries, yes, with Paul Fronczak. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye for now.